On day 3 of the confirmation of charges involving FPRRD, the tension inside the courtroom became more intense as the defense and the prosecution faced each other in a battle not just of evidence, but of narrative, credibility, and legal interpretation. This stage is crucial because confirmation of charges is not yet a trial. It is a filtering process where the judges determine whether there is sufficient evidence to establish substantial grounds to believe that the accused committed the crimes alleged. Hindi pa ito hatol, hindi pa ito conviction. It is about whether the case should move forward to full trial. The prosecution opened the day by reinforcing their theory of the case. They argued that the pattern of actions, public statements, and operational structures during the anti-drug campaign demonstrate a systematic approach that allegedly led to widespread and organized acts. According to them, this is not about isolated incidents. It is about command responsibility, policy direction, and whether there was knowledge and intent at the highest levels. The prosecution emphasized documentary records, sworn statements, and contextual evidence to show that the alleged acts were not random, but part of a broader framework. They carefully walked the judges through timelines, chains of command, and public pronouncements to build what they call a coherent picture of accountability. Sa kabilang banda, the defense strongly pushed back. They argued that the prosecution is relying on inference rather than concrete proof. The defense insisted that speeches and strong rhetoric cannot automatically be equated with criminal intent. Political language, they said, should not be twisted into evidence of unlawful orders. They questioned the reliability of witnesses, pointing out inconsistencies in testimonies and possible motivations behind statements. The defense also stressed that law enforcement operations on the ground involve many independent actors, and that the accused cannot simply be held liable for every action carried out by local units without direct proof of specific unlawful instructions. One of the central clashes on day 3 revolved around the issue of command responsibility. The prosecution argued that leadership carries accountability when there is knowledge of alleged abuses and failure to prevent or punish them. They suggested that patterns of similar incidents across different regions indicate awareness at the top. The defense countered by saying that command responsibility requires strict legal standards. Hindi sapat ang assumption. Kailangan ng malinaw na ebidensya that the accused had effective control and consciously disregarded credible information about alleged crimes. They emphasized that being a precedent does not automatically translate to direct operational control over every police action. Another powerful moment during the session came when discussion shifted to the credibility of data. The prosecution referenced statistics and reports to illustrate scale and frequency. They argued that the numbers themselves point to a widespread situation. The defense challenged the interpretation of those numbers, saying statistics can be misleading without proper context. They argued that crime rates, anti-drug operations, and internal investigations must all be examined carefully before drawing sweeping conclusions. For the defense, context is everything. For the prosecution, pattern is everything. Emotion also played an unspoken role in the courtroom atmosphere. While the proceedings are technical and legal, the underlying issues touch on real lives, real communities, and real consequences. The prosecution framed the case as a matter of justice for victims and international accountability. They emphasized the global principle that no one is above the law. The defense framed it as a matter of sovereignty, fairness, and protection against politically motivated charges. They questioned whether the legal process is being influenced by external pressures or political narratives. Sa Englishman or sa Filipino, malinaw na day 3 highlighted the contrast between two worldviews. The prosecution is constructing a story of systematic policy leading to criminal liability. The defense is dismantling that story piece by piece, arguing that it is built on assumptions and selective interpretation. Both sides are aware that the judges are not deciding guilt beyond reasonable doubt at this stage. The standard is lower, but still significant. The judges must decide whether the evidence reaches the threshold of substantial grounds to proceed. The defense also underscored procedural fairness. They raised concerns about disclosure, the timing of evidence presentation, and the need to ensure that the rights of the accused are fully respected. They reminded the chamber that confirmation hearings are meant to protect individuals from weak or speculative prosecutions. If the evidence is insufficient, the charges should not be confirmed. Simple as that. The prosecution responded by asserting that they have met the required threshold and that detailed evaluation of conflicting testimonies should be reserved for trial. Day 3 became a chess match of legal strategy. Every word mattered. Every reference to jurisprudence, every citation of legal standards, every clarification about the scope of responsibility carried weight. The prosecution leaned on international legal principles and precedent to argue that high-level officials can be held accountable even without direct physical participation. The defense leaned on the same body of law to argue that safeguards exist precisely to prevent overreach and collective blame. For observers, the most striking element was how both sides used the same facts differently. A speech for one side is proof of intent. For the other side, it is political rhetoric. A pattern of incidents for one side is evidence of systematic action. For the other, it is coincidence or decentralized decision-making. This is the heart of adversarial justice. Dalawang magkaibang interpretasyon ng parehong pangyayari. As the session closed, no final decision was made, but the direction became clearer. The judges asked probing questions, signaling that they are carefully weighing issues of jurisdiction, admissibility, and sufficiency of evidence. Day 3 did not determine the outcome, but it sharpened the lines between defense and prosecution. It showed that this confirmation process is not symbolic. It is substantive, technical, and deeply consequential. In the end, Day 3 reminded everyone that the confirmation of charges stage is about threshold, not final truth. It is about whether the case deserves a full trial, where evidence will be tested more rigorously. Habang nagpapatuloy ang proseso, the world watches how law, politics, and accountability intersect. Defense versus prosecution is not just a courtroom battle. It is a test of legal standards, institutional strength, and the principle that justice must be both firm and fair. The first keynote revolves around the powerful and controversial issue of command responsibility versus political rhetoric. On Day 3 of the confirmation proceedings connected to former President Rodrigo Duterte, the courtroom exchange highlighted a deep legal and philosophical divide between how leadership language is interpreted and how criminal liability is established under international law. At the heart of the debate is a fundamental question. When does strong political speech become evidence of criminal intent? And when does it remain protected rhetoric within the sphere of governance? The prosecution's position is built on the doctrine of command responsibility. This principle, recognized in international criminal law and applied by institutions like the International Criminal Court, holds that superiors may be held criminally responsible for crimes committed by subordinates if they had effective control over those subordinates, knew or should have known about the crimes, and failed to prevent or punish them. It is not necessary under this doctrine for a leader to physically participate in unlawful acts. What matters is authority, knowledge, and omission. The prosecution argued that leadership is not symbolic. It carries legal consequences when patterns of alleged abuse emerge under a leader's watch. From the prosecution's perspective, public speeches, repeated statements encouraging aggressive anti-drug operations, and strong messaging toward law enforcement are not isolated words. They are part of a broader context. Words from a head of state are not ordinary comments. They can shape operational culture, influence behavior on the ground, and send signals to subordinates about acceptable conduct. The prosecution suggested that when rhetoric consistently aligns with patterns of alleged excessive force, it becomes relevant evidence. They are not claiming that speech alone constitutes a crime, but that speech, when viewed together with documented incidents and systemic patterns, may reveal intent or at least awareness. Sa pananaw ng prosecution, hindi simpleng political speech ang usapan. They argue that if a leader repeatedly frames a campaign in terms that appear to condone violence or eliminate safeguards, that language can create an environment where subordinates feel emboldened. In international criminal law, context is critical. A single statement might be dismissed as hyperbole, but repeated, consistent messaging, combined with alleged widespread acts, may contribute to establishing knowledge or even policy direction. For them, command responsibility is about accountability at the top when there is an alleged climate of permissiveness. The defense strongly rejected this interpretation. They emphasized that political rhetoric, especially during intense national campaigns against crime, often involves strong and emotional language. Democratically elected leaders frequently use forceful words to express policy priorities. According to the defense, equating rhetorical toughness with criminal intent risks criminalizing political speech. They warned that such a move would lower the threshold for liability and create a dangerous precedent where policy advocacy becomes prosecutable conduct. The defense also focused on the strict legal elements required for command responsibility. Under international standards, it is not enough to show that crimes occurred or that the accused held a high position. There must be proof of effective control over the alleged perpetrators. Effective control means the material ability to prevent or punish the commission of crimes. The defense argued that in a large and complex government structure, operational control is often decentralized. Law enforcement units operate under layered chains of command, and the president does not directly supervise each operation. Therefore, holding a national leader automatically liable for every alleged abuse would stretch the doctrine beyond its intended scope. Isa pang mahalagang punto ng depensa ay ang requirement ng knowledge. They stressed that the prosecution must demonstrate that the accused either knew or should have known about specific unlawful acts and failed to act. General awareness of crime-fighting operations is not the same as knowledge of unlawful conduct. The defense insisted that there must be credible, reliable evidence showing that information about alleged abuses reached the highest level and that there was a deliberate failure to respond. Without such proof, command responsibility cannot stand. The exchange on day 3 illustrated how both sides use the same legal doctrine but interpret its application differently. The prosecution views leadership as inherently powerful and influential. They argue that repeated public endorsements of harsh tactics, combined with alleged patterns of violence, support an inference of awareness and tacit approval. The defense views leadership through a narrower legal lens. They argue that criminal responsibility must remain individualized and concrete, not inferred from tone or style of governance. Another dimension of the debate concerns the stage of proceedings. This is not yet a trial. The judges are assessing whether there are substantial grounds to believe that the crimes were committed and that the accused may be responsible. The prosecution argued that at this stage, they are not required to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They only need to show sufficient evidence to move forward. Therefore, they contend that the combination of speeches, operational data, and witness statements meets the confirmation threshold. The defense countered by saying that even at the confirmation stage, the standards are meaningful and protective. The process is designed to filter out weak or speculative cases. If the evidence relies heavily on interpretation of rhetoric, without direct proof of unlawful orders or conscious disregard, then confirming the charges would undermine the safeguards built into the system. For them, presumption of innocence remains central, even at this preliminary phase. Emotionally and politically, the debate resonates beyond the courtroom. Supporters may see strong rhetoric as decisive leadership against crime. Critics may see the same rhetoric as contributing to an atmosphere where abuses allegedly occurred. Legally, however, the judges must separate political perception from evidentiary value. The task is to determine whether the speeches and actions form part of a coherent evidentiary framework that satisfies the legal elements of command responsibility. Sa huli, ang banggaan ng command responsibility at political rhetoric ay sumasalamin sa mas malalim na tanong tungkol sa kapangyarihan at pananagutan. How far does accountability extend for those at the highest levels of authority? Can words, when combined with patterns of conduct, establish knowledge or intent? Or must liability be tied strictly to direct, documented instructions and concrete proof of control? Day 3 did not answer these questions definitively, but it sharpened them. What became clear is that this issue is not about silencing political speech, nor about shielding leaders from scrutiny. It is about defining the legal boundary between governance and criminal responsibility. The prosecution seeks to show that leadership language and systemic patterns intersect in a way that meets international standards for accountability. The defense seeks to ensure that legal standards remain precise, demanding, and resistant to overextension. The judges now carry the responsibility of weighing these arguments carefully, knowing that their decision will shape not only the trajectory of the case, but also the broader understanding of how international law treats those who wield the highest power. The second keynote centers on the intense legal clash between pattern-based evidence and the requirement of proof that rises above mere assumption. On day 3 of the confirmation proceedings involving former President Rodrigo Duterte before the International Criminal Court, this issue became one of the most debated aspects of the exchange between the defense and the prosecution. At stake is not simply the interpretation of facts, but the methodology of how responsibility is inferred from those facts. The prosecution's strategy rests heavily on demonstrating patterns. They argue that when numerous incidents share similar characteristics, timing, operational style, geographic spread, and victim profiles, those similarities are not coincidental. Instead, they may indicate a systematic framework. In international criminal law, patterns are often used to establish that alleged crimes were widespread or systematic, which is a key contextual element in certain categories of offenses. The prosecution therefore emphasizes statistics, documented reports, witness testimonies, and operational similarities to build what they describe as a coherent narrative. From their perspective, isolated cases might be dismissed as rogue actions by individual officers. But when incidents appear repeatedly across different regions and over an extended period, the argument shifts. The prosecution contends that repetition suggests structure, and structure implies direction or at least tolerance from higher authorities. They are not merely counting numbers, they are drawing connections. For them, the accumulation of consistent accounts creates a mosaic of evidence. Each individual piece may not tell the full story, but together they form a picture that meets the confirmation threshold. Sa pananaw ng prosekusyon, hindi sapat na tingnan ang bawat insidente ng hiwa-hiwalay. The law, they argue, allows the chamber to assess contextual evidence as a whole. Patterns can demonstrate knowledge, policy, or systematic conduct. They insist that when similar narratives arise from different sources who had no connection with one another, the probability of coincidence diminishes. Therefore, pattern-based evidence becomes a powerful tool in establishing substantial grounds to proceed. The defense challenged this framework directly. They argued that pattern recognition can easily slip into assumption. Statistics, they said, do not automatically equal proof of criminal policy. A high number of operations or casualties during an aggressive anti-crime campaign does not by itself prove unlawful intent. Correlation is not causation. The defense warned that relying too heavily on aggregated data risks replacing individualized proof with general impressions. One of the defense's key arguments is that confirmation of charges requires linking the accused personally to the alleged crimes. Even if patterns exist, there must still be a clear connection between those patterns and the individual responsibility of the accused. Without that link, the evidence may describe a situation, but it does not establish personal criminal liability. The defense stressed that legal accountability is not collective. It cannot be imposed simply because someone held office during a controversial period. They also questioned the reliability of the data sources cited by the prosecution. Statistics can vary depending on methodology, reporting standards, and verification processes. Witness testimonies may contain inconsistencies. Reports from advocacy groups may rely on secondary sources. The defense argued that the chamber must carefully scrutinize how each number was obtained, how each statement was recorded, and whether alternative explanations were sufficiently explored. For them, assumptions may hide behind the appearance of volume. Another layer of the debate concerns the standard applicable at this stage. The prosecution reminded the chamber that they do not need to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt during confirmation. They only need to establish substantial grounds to believe that crimes were committed and that the accused may be responsible. In their view, pattern-based evidence is particularly suitable at this stage because it demonstrates a plausible and coherent case theory that merits full trial examination. The defense responded that even though the threshold is lower than at trial, it is not negligible. The confirmation process exists to prevent speculative prosecutions from moving forward. If patterns are presented without concrete, individualized linkage, the chamber risks allowing inference to substitute for proof. The defense emphasized that substantial grounds must still be grounded in solid, reliable evidence, not broad generalizations. Emotionally, the pattern versus proof debate also reflects differing worldviews about how systemic harm is identified. The prosecution views repetition and similarity as indicators of structure. They argue that systemic problems rarely leave behind explicit written orders. Instead, they manifest through consistent operational behavior. In international cases, direct evidence of a leader's intent may be rare. Circumstantial and contextual evidence often carry significant weight. Therefore, patterns become essential tools. The defense, however, views the same approach as potentially dangerous. They argue that in large-scale national campaigns, many incidents may share characteristics simply because they are part of similar law enforcement operations. Uniform procedures, similar tactics, and comparable outcomes do not necessarily prove illegality. The defense insists that without direct evidence of unlawful directives or conscious tolerance of crimes, patterns remain descriptive rather than determinative. Habang tumatagal ang diskusyon, lumilinaw na ang tunay na isyu ay kung paano binabalanse ang inference at presumption of innocence. In criminal law, inference is permitted, but it must be reasonable and supported by evidence. The prosecution believes their mosaic of data meets that requirement. The defense believes the mosaic has gaps too large to ignore. Each side accuses the other of stretching interpretation beyond what the evidence can sustain. The judge's role becomes crucial in this context. They must assess not only the quantity of evidence, but its quality and coherence. Does the pattern presented logically support the inference of systematic conduct? Is the linkage to the accused sufficiently grounded? Are alternative explanations plausible? These are not simple arithmetic questions. They are analytical judgments that require careful reasoning. In the broader perspective, the clash between pattern-based evidence and proof beyond assumption speaks to a central tension in international criminal justice. Large-scale cases often involve complex societal events rather than isolated acts. Establishing accountability in such contexts requires drawing conclusions from multiple strands of evidence. Yet the legal system must guard against overreach. The presumption of innocence remains fundamental, even when allegations are grave. Day 3 demonstrated that this tension is not theoretical. It plays out in detailed argumentation over documents, testimonies, and statistics. The prosecution seeks to show that repetition reveals design. The defense seeks to show that repetition alone proves nothing about intent or personal responsibility. Both arguments are grounded in legal principle, but they point in opposite directions. Ultimately, the question is whether the patterns described rise to the level of substantial grounds to proceed to trial. That decision will signal how the chamber views the balance between contextual inference and individualized proof. It will determine whether the case advances to a stage where evidence will be tested more rigorously, witnesses cross-examined, and competing interpretations examined in full depth. Day 3 made clear that this keynote is not merely about numbers or reports. It is about defining the boundary between logical inference and impermissible assumption in the pursuit of justice.